Hey everyone, Devin Greer here with Linux Reviewed. So this week we were originally supposed to be looking at OwnCloud, and unfortunately trying to demo OwnCloud on Ubuntu server virtually, like using something like VirtualBox, it doesn't work really well. So probably have to wait till next week or the week after when I can get it together, and we'll end up using a service like OwnCloud. I run it on physical hardware, but I'm not going to wipe and reload my server just to demo how to set up OwnCloud and review it. It's still something I want to do, but I have to wait until I can get some funds together to use DigitalOcean. It's really, really cheap, but you got kids, you know, spending a little money where you shouldn't be. Sometimes family doesn't get too happy about that. So this week we're going to look at something completely different. It's been a little while since we've done an actual desktop review, about the second week right now, and so we're going to look at Antergos Linux. So it's going to be very interesting, being that it's another Arch-based Linux distribution. It's going to be cool. It's going to be really, really cool. We'll go over that here in a minute. But first thing, app pick of the week. Right? So we're going to look at Everpad. Everpad is a client that you can use to sync with Evernote. As you guys know, there is no native Evernote support for Linux. Not yet, and probably not in the foreseeable future. But this client will actually give you the ability to have that same synchronization. Now, I tried looking, I couldn't find an official page. It seems like their official pages are GitHub. So you could go over to GitHub to kind of look it up, but this video is really going to show you how to install it. As you notice, this right here gives you the code you need for Ubuntu 12.04 Plus. If you are on Fedora, I've tried installing this on some Fedora installs I've got running around the house. I have had not the greatest experience getting this up and running on Fedora. And then for Arch Linux, it's available in the AUR. So if I go over here, now you'll notice this is not the default theming. This is just the theming that's with the current desktop. So it looks like Evernote, but this is not their actual icon that you'll see. So you can first go into the settings and management. So at this point, this is where you would set your authorization. You can set your sync. You can set to start with the system. You can also go in and do some things with the appearance. We can then come over here and we can go to all notes, which will then open up your note area, which you can at this point create notebooks or do create separate notes. So we can go and we can create a separate note. It opens it up, and I mean, it's very simplistic. I mean, Evernote, if you've ever used the actual Evernote client, especially the one that ships with Windows, it's got a little bit more than this, but at the end of the day, this is really going to get your job done. You can come in and change your titles, so we could do Linux Reviewed. We can come here, we can put new show, showing Everpad. And I mean, there's a bunch of different ways. So I can come in, I can say, want to move it around. It's overall a decent client. Is it as great as maybe Everpad in itself or Evernote? Probably not. But for those of you who and see, look, syncs right away. Saved. It's now on there, which then means that I can go over here to my Android phone, and it should pop up on there with no problems because I have the Evernote client. Let's see, Evernote. Phone has been running so slow today. So let's see. Let's go all notes. Let's close the ad. Let's see if I got to sync it. Notebooks. And there it is. Easy as that. Syncs between all of my, yeah, right there. So, it gives you a good sync. I use it a bit. I typically am not like one who has like mountains and mountains of notes. Typically I make myself work lists, and it's really good to be able to come in here, create myself a note here, which then will sync to my phone, so when I'm at work but not at the office, I can go to look at what I'm doing, or I can hop on my work computer and I have the Evernote client there and I'm able to completely see that as well. The only thing I'll bring up that you guys need to know is it's not, so let's see, go settings and management. When you first set it up, sync delay, it is defaulted to 30 minutes, so unless you change it or you manually tell it to sync, it's not going to pull any notes in for you right off the get-go. It'll wait till it's destined sync time. So after a fresh install, you might want to set your sync to 5 minutes, and then once it pulls everything in, then go ahead and be good with it. So the next area of topic I want to discuss is Android really a Linux distribution? So you know what's funny is, like, I remember when Android first came around, everyone was like, especially in Linux and open source, everyone was like, oh man, this is great, this is awesome, you know, Android is Linux. And then it became popular. And then like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's not really Linux. Oh yeah, no, it's like totally not Linux. And you can kind of see that like with Ubuntu. Like Ubuntu was like the golden child of Linux distributions. Then after it became like popular, I'd say somewhere around the time it hit like 10 million users, 20 million users, which was about 2 years ago, like everyone criticizes Ubuntu anymore. I have my issues with them, but I don't make it a point to go out and fry them every point in turn, like some people do. So the question is Android really a Linux distribution? And this was probably my favorite part right here. Repeat after me, Android is just as much as Linux as Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, or anything else that uses the Linux kernel. Technically, a better term would be a Linux distribution, since Linux is just itself, just a kernel. Now, I read through this article. It was just to kind of like bring up a point, give you guys some kind of visual. This guy, there are certain parts I kind of couldn't figure out what side of the fence he was actually standing on. But let me tell you where I stand on it. Android is Linux, people. There's two things you got to think about. Often when people sit down and say, well, it's a modded kernel. Dear God. Do you know any distributions mod their kernel? Quite a few, actually. Very many of them don't ship the exact same kernel that is intended. And the only reason why it's a modded kernel is because, do you know how much stuff is in the Linux kernel and how much of it does not apply to the phone in itself? There are drivers in the kernel that a phone will never use. Why would you not mod the Linux kernel for Android? It's almost like a common sense thing. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like super common sense. It's like, just because turbochargers on a gasoline engine makes a car move faster doesn't mean that turbocharger will work on an electric motor. It won't. Same concept here. And some people are like, oh, it's a bad analogy. It's like, no, it's really not. Linux kernel is designed to run on a mass quantity of hardware. It would be silly for Google to not modify that kernel. The second part I'm going to bring into this is, ladies and gentlemen, Android is very much Linux. However, it is not GNU. It is a known fact that Android actually possesses almost no GNU products in it, as they are completely unnecessary to the phone, or tablet, whatever you want to call it. So at the end of the day, Linux is very much a part of Android. However, there's a huge difference. You could argue the level of open source that Android has. You could argue the lack of GNU. But you can't argue, I've seen this argument busting up all over the place about, well, is Android Linux? Yes, very much. It's using a Linux kernel. Well, it's modified. Duh. I don't need in my ARM cell phone freaking integrated graphics drivers for Intel. Why would you use that? It's stupid. It's horribly stupid. So, and by the way, there is actually a Linux distribution that is made by Android. It's Android x86, and you can run it on a full screen size laptop like this, and I believe it has full terminal capability. And that, I think, would be the other argument. I've heard a few people say, well, there's no command line because the phone's not rooted. If you root it, you have full command line necessities there. So you can say what you want, but last time I checked, it's Linux, and it's just sad that as a community, that anytime something Linux does become somewhat popular, we turn around and shoot it down. Oh, all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, that's not Linux. When it first came out, I was like, oh yeah, dude, totally Linux. At the end of the day, the Linux Foundation recognizes it. The people who write the kernel recognize Android. I'm just saying, the people who write the damn kernel call Android Linux. So that's enough of the rant for the week there. Next, we're going to look at Antergos. This has been very interesting. Let me tell you what actually comes to be so interesting about Antergos. And one of my more popular videos was Manjaro Linux. And what makes this so interesting is, one time, you go back several years ago, anytime you saw a new distribution coming about, it was typically Ubuntu-based or Debian-based, which Ubuntu is based on Debian, so therefore everything is based off Debian. And it was like, wow, this is cool. But, after a while, we kind of sit down and it's like, wow, it's like we're taking the wheel and reinventing it, but we're not even reinventing it to make it better. We just keep, oh, here's another distribution based on Debian or Ubuntu. Over the last several years, I'd say 2 years, I've been watching these Linux distributions base themselves off Arch Linux. Now, for those of you who are like, well, they're both rolling release, right? Like you have Debian, which is rolling release, you have Arch Linux, which is a rolling release, but there's actually a difference. Debian is what we refer to as a semi-rolling, which means there's a full rolling release, but the difference is they release only certain updates, but the whole OS will upgrade from time to time. Arch Linux is a full rolling release, meaning that it is upgrading, like every day you're getting updates. So I could be running kernel 4.0 today, and tomorrow I'll be running kernel 4.1. And it's not a full system upgrade. I don't have to do any special commands. I just run my update manager, and it does it. So we're starting to see these newer Linux distributions which come about, and they finally said, there's enough Debian out there. Let's start building on Arch. Because the beauty about Arch and being a rolling release is, hypothetically, the more people who join the community, the more people who help fix bugs and develop code and things like that, the idea is that a rolling release could become effectively as stable, if not in many ways more stable, than your distributions which do releases every 6 months to a year to 2 years, whatever. So Antergos is a very interesting product. Now, what we're going to look at with Antergos, because the huge thing, if you watch my Manjaro video, it is very much based on Arch, but there's a lot of huge differences between Manjaro and Arch. The question is does Antergos actually separate itself at all? So let's take a first look. You guys are probably seeing these nice little slides that are flipping through. They have a very nice website, and it's nice to see because, nope, don't want none of the Facebookage. It's very nice to see because, really at the end of the day, I remember when they first came around, their website wasn't bad, but it felt more like an information page. They talk about the essentials, how everything you need, its default configuration provides you with ready-to-use system, no additional steps are required after installation, okay. Rolling release, it talks about its rolling release, and multilingual, which is always definitely a good thing. And multilingual will also tell you really two things. One, they do want to be used on a global scale, that's the first thing. And then, of course, the second thing is also the fact that it's getting some success, because I doubt the developers are 100% multilingual in every language. That means that they're getting people from around the world who are using their product and doing their translations, which means there is a little bit of pickup going, and it's obviously a big deal to the developers. Down here is where you get a little bit more information regarding new things that's going on with them. We can go here to their info page. We can go about Antergos. It'll bring us here. Looks kind of the same, but it is actually different. It's a rolling release distribution. Your entire base components, blah blah blah, multilingual, helpful community. Then they talk about their story. Now, for those of you who don't really know, it's kind of interesting. Antergos has been around actually for quite some time. I think 3 years now, but it wasn't always called Antergos. It used to be called CineArch. CineArch was basically Arch Linux with a GUI installer that didn't work half the time, but your only option was the Cinnamon desktop. it wasn't really all that bad. I actually really liked CineArch, and actually I think, yeah, look, let's see if it'll let me make it bigger. There they go. There, it's in a different language, but as you can see, CineArch, I remember testing it. I thought it was great. I love Cinnamon, but I'm not a huge fan of it in the Arch side of the house, and I'll explain that in a bit. So, I mean, it's really interesting to see everything that they've come through and they've developed, and how they've grown. That's always been very exciting. One of the other big things is they also include Numix. So them and Numix project are working together, and it's actually kind of cool. Something we're starting to see now. You know, at one time, you used the default settings of the desktop. Otherwise, it was on you to build all the icons if you wanted custom icons. There's now these groups like Mocha and Numix that are building all these great custom icons that allow a distribution to very easily distinct themselves from everybody else. All right, so let's get out of the browser here for a minute. Let's go here. Let's open up the file manager. Let's go. I pulled these. So let's talk about the installer a little bit. So the question is, what is the difference between, say, Arch Linux and Antergos? First off, I'd like to point out to you guys this right here. So in Arch Linux, you typically have this long black screen. Now, I do recommend, and I want this very clearly known, I'm not bagging or ragging on Arch Linux at all. I think actually everyone should try Arch Linux at one time and go through the hellacious installation it takes. It's fun, and I tell you, I learned so much. That's where I learned how to partition, was Arch Linux several years back. I've always been more of a default setting kind of guy, but it was cool to do that and read up on, well, what is partitioning, how many different options of partitioning are out there, and what should I use. But initially it's all command line based. Antergos is not. So Antergos does the same thing that Arch Linux does, which, by the way, if I may point, well, we'll get to the negatives here in a second. But you have your options. So you could do a base install, which means basically it's just the Arch Linux core. Now, for those of you who are like, why would I do that? Excellent server platform. There you go. You have Cinnamon, GNOME, KDE, Mate, OpenBox, and XFCE. In fact, basically every desktop imaginable, with the exception of I don't see LXDE or LXQT. However, being that it's Arch-based, you probably could get those, install them yourselves. The reason they don't include it is probably because of trying to keep the image size down, and they're not very popular, or probably because there's some issue with installing that desktop in the scripts that they're building to do that. So, I mean, it's really cool. You get to go through, you get to pick your favorite desktop. As you can see here, I've picked the GNOME desktop. Cinnamon is an excellent desktop. So for those of you who are like, oh yeah, dude, I'm going to get Cinnamon, they'll tell you, like back in the day when I was running like straight up Arch, the thing I learned about Cinnamon is it's a great desktop. However, it feels like the Linux developers, or the Linux Mint developers, Clem, who is the primary godfather of Cinnamon, it's almost like he builds it and then throws it at the Arch community to beat the hell out of it, and then get the bug fixes from them or see what bugs they draw. So when I'd run Cinnamon, it felt like it was breaking all the time on me. Not like horrible, it was still very usable, but like, you know, I remember one time like my battery meter completely didn't work. So the way I knew if my battery was going or not was estimating the rough time, but depending on the task, you know, the time can fluctuate. If I have a web browser Word open, not really too bad. If I've got, say, this program running, my time gets cut in about half. So then I'd have to look at the lights on the bottom of my laptop to see where I was at. But all of the desktops are really great. I will tell you, though, in my experience, GNOME has always been a little bit more rock solid. It's a very widely used desktop. But that may be opinionated, and that's okay. We're all entitled to an opinion, I think. The next part is this. This is another really crucial component of the Antergos installer. So you get to a point where they will let you pick and select additional packages you want upon install. So you could technically do this through the installer of when you do Arch. However, most people just get everything set up, get their desktop installed, reboot, go into their desktop, I'm going to start installing these. But then you're going to be going through and setting them up. Okay, I will tell you, using this tool is not faster. It just makes myself more lazy, and I mean that in a positive way. Because I only have to manually go and type. I go and I check mark everything I want. So I want the AUR support. And for those of you who aren't Arch users, the AUR is this additional repository that you can add to give your Arch build a huge, I mean, extremely huge amount of extra additional software. But you can get your LibreOffice. I know it's not all in English, but you know, it's whatever. Firefox will be an option. I think I checkmarked almost all of them. Uncomplicated firewall, UFW. Go ahead and install it, runs, and it goes. So, I mean, that's pretty awesome, right? You know, so, you know, if you got some stuff going on, you can go through this installer, set all the basic software you need to get up and going, and then you can walk away and go do what you got to do, and you come back, you know it's there. It's not like, okay, I got to sit in front of that command line and do more work. But now here comes the next question. How far has Antergos separated itself from Arch Linux? Let's take a look here. So there is some noticeable differences. For starters, we have, let's see, let me open it up. You have the Update Manager. Now the Update Manager scares me. And here's the reason why. And it probably has been fixed by this point. But like in Manjaro Linux, there's times you'll run updates and it won't finish installing the updates or pulling them down. You have to go and use different aspects of it. So you have that part right there. I'm more of a terminal kind of guy when you use the Arch side of the house. So you just do, you know, sudo pacman -S lowercase yu. Put your updates all down the same, and it seems to be all right. Now let's see if I can hit it from here. Let's go grab the package manager. Okay, so this here will allow you to search for results, and those results also include the AUR. So example being, I can come in here, and let's see, what would be a good one? Let's search for Banshee. Okay, and there we go. And it gives me Banshee. It tells me which repository, so it could be just the extra, it could be the AUR. It looks like a lot of AUR. And then, at least for the extra repository, it gives me the rough size of it. You know, what's it going to be? We could look at, say, like music. It's there. It's only available in the AUR. Now we could look at Steam. Steam multi-lib. It's also available in the AUR. Alrighty. So, I mean, there's a lot here that you can look at. And it looks like we can go back and query old searches. And essentially I would go in, I would check mark what I want. Okay. If it lets me, there we go. And then you hit the check mark here and it'll apply changes. And essentially, you know, for those of you who started on Ubuntu before there was an App Center or Software Center, you know, you would use Synaptic, which works very much the same. This is, in my opinion, a little cleaner, but it, you know, definitely it does work. So you get that fundamentally. You get an update manager, you get a package manager, which you wouldn't typically get in an Arch Linux distribution. You also get all of these, this Unix theme, which is very attractive. Some people don't care for Unix. To me, it's very iOS looking, but it's not absolutely the worst thing in the world either. So, yeah. There isn't really much more to talk about. The only place where you would ever actually know this is Antergos and not Arch Linux, I mean, not in fact you know this and you install it, is, and I don't know if I can find a picture of it, but your login session. It's not the traditional GNOME login, and it does say Antergos on the login screen. But, you know, I guess it's where you got to draw the line. By just there is an additional Antergos repository. There's a GUI installer, and then it says Antergos on the login. Does that make it Antergos? Because essentially, you guys have to understand something. There's a thing called, the GPL. And the distributions are allowed, with the GPL's permission, to sit down and say, if you make any change to our distribution, cool, redistribute it. But you can't use our name anymore. Fedora actually very clearly outlines that. So I could take Fedora Linux, I could plug in the Fedi, which is a utility system that will allow them to add additional repositories, additional software, blah, 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 and I could ship it and distribute it that way and say Fedora should be distributed this way. Cool, but as per the GPL, I can't call it Fedora anymore. I have to call it, Devon Linux Reviewed OS. I would probably never ship Fedora with something like that, but you get my point. Same concept here. This is, in my opinion, this is Arch Linux done easy. And I will tell you, in my opinion, you all of you, need to try to do that Arch Linux initially install. It's not as bad. It's time consuming, but it's not hard. It really isn't. Watch a couple YouTube videos on it. Do some good guides. The Arch Wiki is great. You'll see it's not that bad. Now, if you're a distro hopper and you're like, well, I love Arch Linux, but every time I hop back to Arch Linux, I got to go through an installer. Use Antergos. Now let's start to go on some of the downsides, some of the issues that I've seen so far. First off, let's go back to the site. Okay. There is a place where I'm trying to see. There's a place where they talk about the purpose of Antergos is to provide a moderate, elegant, and powerful operating system based on one of the available Arch Linux. Users need not be Linux experts, nor developers, nor to use Antergos. Now, I agree with it to a point. Arch Linux is nowhere near as bad. Once you get it rolling and you get it going and you get it set up, it is nowhere near as bad as everyone makes it out to be. People make Arch Linux out to be like, if you were running Arch, you need to be wearing this huge patch of pride. Now, with that being said, is Arch Linux as easy as Ubuntu? No. Not at all. I, in Ubuntu, have almost never had to go in and look at my repository list. Arch Linux I have to every time, because in Arch Linux, 32-bit libraries are not enabled by default. It's called multi-lib. So if you have applications you're going to install that require 32-bit or 32-bit part packages, essentially, you need to go into the repository list and uncheck that. So one of my complaints is, yes, Antergos could be for everyone, and maybe that's their goal. However, there's still a lot of the Arch left in this where you would have to be somewhat savvy or just enjoy reading in general to get past that point. My next complaint, though, on the initial page, so here we see they talk about we're based on Arch Linux. I have issues with that, and here's the main reason why. It's kind of like how Ubuntu has slowly over the years separated itself from Debian and from the name Linux in itself. Depending on who their developers are talking to, yes, we are based on Debian. Yes, we are Ubuntu Linux. But when you go to when they promote to the end user, the person who's never heard of them, Debian's never mentioned, Linux is never mentioned, which is fine. I get it from that point. But Canonical and Ubuntu have received so much grief because of that. They've received hell over that. And on this first page here, going through, I would never know this is an Arch-based distribution. I would never know. And that may be a good thing. Maybe this is going to be like the Ubuntu. This is going to be to, how Ubuntu is to Debian as this is to Arch, in a sense. I mean, maybe they're going to take it there. But I think they also need to be careful, because I know a lot of people I've talked to through the web who use Antergos. Most of them are just Arch users who do quite a bit of distro hopping and don't want to do the Arch install every time. A few of them are pretty clever. They have scripts that they just run upon install, and it does all their work for them. But essentially, this is a quick way to get Arch Linux installed, get ready on the box. that. The only other thing, presentation was kind of a big issue for me. When I first came in here, I didn't even have a web browser available. I had Pigeon, which it's like, excuse me, this is the GNOME desktop. Put Empathy in there. I mean, I don't use them, but it's that initial first presentation. If I want pure vanilla GNOME, or at least as close as I can get to it, why is Pigeon installed? I mean, I really prefer Empathy. Now, yeah, if I was on KDE, I probably would rather have Pigeon. But initially, why is that there? I mean, there's hardly any apps. And, some of you are probably like, but it's an Arch base, so like that's what you want, right? For me, yes. However, if I'm going to try and market this as my product and then contribute upstream to Arch to make my product better, I'm going to make sure it packages more nicely than this. The only benefit I saw was Numix came, and I happen to like Numix. But honestly, for the type of crowd that they're pulling in, I really don't think Numix was a wise choice. I would have much rather seen vanilla GNOME than that. So that's just me. If we go back and we look through those pictures that I was showing you guys, right? What would almost be nice is for them to do almost like an evolution setup. And if you know what those are, that's basically also Arch installed easily. The only difference is it's not a distribution. It is legitimately just a GUI installer for Arch Linux. Is for them to include where if I am literally just wanting to use this as a way to install Arch as quickly as possible, give me the ability to either opt in or opt out of the Antergos extras. Okay, like seriously, and that'll even give them a baseline. That'll let them know if they're able somehow to notice that, okay, we had 1 million downloads of our ISO over the last 3 months, but yet only 100,000 people are pulling from our actual repository. Probably a good sign that people want the easy install of Arch without your stuff. That's just my thought process. The only other downside to this that I've seen, and some of you probably have heard about this with Arch Linux, okay, is that in order to install Arch Linux, get all this beautifulness here, and don't know, I've been using this for a few days, so I've been installing a lot of stuff. Okay. You have to have an internet connection with Arch. It pulls everything down from the internet. It's how they keep really slim ISO images, and furthermore, because of how Arch is built, you shouldn't, I mean, maybe it would work, but you shouldn't be able to take an Arch install. The idea is if they were to package it as an ISO image like Ubuntu does and ship it to you, and it's like, you don't need internet, you can install it. Well, the problem is the next time you get internet connection, if it's been 6 months, more than likely things are not going to install like they should, technically. So it's best to always, because it's a rolling release, pull the latest and greatest down from the web. So Antergos also suffers from that major flaw. Even though you'll read on their site that they often sound like they're packaging a new stuff all the time for the installer, it's like, that's cool, but at the end of the day, still need the internet, which is kind of one of the flaws of Arch Linux. Some people would argue, no, that's perfect common sense there. I would agree with them. I mean, everything's the same. It's GNOME. This is running GNOME 3.16 right now. And then kernel 4.0, which was a huge kernel. And look, guys, look. So you'll ever notice when you look at Ubuntu, Ubuntu ships kernel number -generic 4.0.1-1-arch. Does that mean this kernel's been modified by the Arch team? Maybe. I really don't care, but I'm just back to that whole Android thing, modification of kernel. So where do I stand on this? Where am I going to rate this? To be honest with you, I hadn't tested the OwnCloud thing. I had actually installed Antergos because I had been an Arch user in the past, and I love how fast Arch is, how stable Arch can be, depending on your package selection and how you've configured everything. But I didn't want to do that install because I've done it like 2 or 3 times now, and it's not horrible. It's really not. It's time consuming because you go, like the partitioning's pretty quick, but when you go start pulling packages down in certain components, it's very timely. And so is this, but at least I could set everything up and walk away while it pulls and then installs as I directed it to. And I was very curious, and is Antergos, how close is it to the original Arch line? And this is where I draw the hardship of giving you guys my opinion, because I don't know. I mean, it's great, it is Arch Linux, but that's the thing. In my opinion, Antergos has not done enough to make it their own. And then it's really conflicting when you go to their website, because their website dictates that they are their own product. However, it's basically Arch Linux. Like Manjaro does a lot and enables a lot of stuff to make it easy for the end user. Here, there's a lot of footwork. I mean, I use Yort to get most of my software because the Arch repo is not large enough for me. And then with Yort, you have to know what you're doing to make Yort work. And for those of you who are like, what is Yort? Let me give you an example. So I would type in Yort. Let's see, what would be a huge one? Let's do Blender, because I think I have Blender installed, right? Go pull and see, look at that. There's over 34 options of it, and some of them don't even make sense, like Yo Frankie slash demo slash or dash. I mean, but you'd have to know to come in to look at. Okay, I already have Blender installed, and it's this version number, and I don't know if I got it from Arch or from here, or if it'll tell me which one. But you got to watch, because you say I didn't have any installed, and this one here has 62, but this one only had 3. Probably going to go with the most up-to-date with the largest number next to it. But then you have some that are like out of date. And I've had this issue where I use TeamViewer to provide most of my support, and I'd show how to do the installation, but I already have it installed. I could, I don't want to mess with it. So, I mean, there's still a lot here that you have to do because there's not large enough repos, and it is Arch, so the updates roll daily. So there is a chance of breakage, and there's a chance of a little footwork that needs to get done. So I'm going to rate Antergos Linux a 7.5 out of 10. And it's the best 7.5 out of 10 of all time, and this is why I say it. I'm giving it a 7.5 because of the simple fact it's not clear on what they're providing. Looking at their site, I'm confused. I'm feeling like it's their own baked product, when in reality it's basically Arch Linux with a Numix theme and their name on the installer and their name on the login screen. To me, that, and they do have a repo which you can enable or disable, but they didn't remove any of the Arch repos. You can add Yort. So, like I said, guys, it's like taking Fedora and throwing one package in there and then changing the name and redistributing and not doing anything else. There's not enough here to give them credit because there's still so much Arch in it, and I prefer that. That's what I think. That's their niche in the market, is the Arch users who are like, dude, love using Arch, hate doing the install. I'm just going to use Antergos. But because of that, because I'm not really clear which direction they're going, are they trying to be that, or are they starting to try and become like Manjaro Linux, where they're their own product? I'm going to give them a 7.5. And I'll tell you right now, if you're thinking about Antergos Linux, dude, the only way I would do it is if you want to be an Arch user. There isn't enough here for you to use Antergos as its own breed. It is Arch Linux. It is the Arch Linux with some Antergos badging on it. But that's the case. So hopefully next week I will put together an own cloud server. Probably going to have to use DigitalOcean because I'm not sacrificing my build on my server for this show. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just, my wife uses own cloud. Family pictures are on own cloud. And I back things up. But it goes down, she's probably going to freak out. Not the way I want to go. So if you guys have any questions, if you feel like I'm completely wrong, you're like, no, Antergos is really its own thing, let me know. But otherwise, next week we'll be probably doing own cloud if everything can get up and running correctly, and I'm definitely glad to show that to you guys. Thanks.